just to continue the conversation where we left off. So, recall what Michael Curtis calls the Black Muslim scare of the 1960s, um, which, I mean, it is fair to say, and I think that this is pointed out in the reading, perhaps indirectly, but it's still there, that even since the 1930s, there was a concerted governmental program of surveillance, of surveillance and containment towards the Black Muslim movement. And in the 1930s, it was the so-called Racon or Racon, I don't know, the RACON, Racon, survey of racial conditions in the U.S. That's what it's. No, I mean that was the report that Racon produced, warning. This was, I think, the report came out in the early 1940s. I believe it was 1943, warning that the Black Muslim movement is a nationalist movement. It's a danger to, poses a risk to national security. That insisting that Black Islam is an ideology, not a religion, as we emphasized last class, sort of contemplating or expressing loudly the idea that, well, the solution to this problem is that we ought to do everything possible, and by we I mean the government, the federal government, to make the Black Muslim movement more like Orthodox Islam. But as we talked about last class, by Orthodox Islam, what the federal government had in mind was not the Islam of Turkey or the Islam of Indonesia or the Islam of Timbuktu or Moroccan Islam or even the Islam of Egypt. It was really the Islam of Arabia, more specifically Saudi Arabia. And as we talked about, the Islam of Saudi Arabia, especially throughout until very very recently, was summed up in the Wahhabi movement. And as I said last class, the Wahhabi movement was particularly puritanical. It had a long list of what it considered to be heretical within Islam. So Wahhabi Islam, or the Islam that was adopted by the Al Saud family when they created the country of Saudi Arabia, considered all the mystical tradition in Islam to be heretical, considered all the racialist tradition to be heretical, and what they became rather infamous for. This is from the time that Wahhabism emerged in the 18th century all the way to the 1960s, is that nearly all their victims were Muslim. So what they sort of made themselves rather infamous for is that they were a very fearsome, terrorizing force in Arabia. They massacred, no one knows the real numbers, but they massacred, any Muslims that they considered to be heretical, which included the Shiites, included Sufi movements, included various jurisprudential movements. Of course, eventually, the needs of politics had a moderating effect on Wahhabism, because before the creation of the Saudi state, the Wahhabis were basically free to not just cleanse Arabia of any dissidents, but they also invaded Bahrain, they also invaded Yemen, they invaded what is today Jordan. They had become so notorious at one point for their massacres that Egypt, this was during the Ottoman Empire in the 1800s, Egypt ends up sending an expeditionary force to fight off the Wahhabis, to defeat them, to secure the holy sites. And the Egyptian military expedition in the 1800s was extremely successful, but after defeating them, the Egyptians withdrew back to Egypt, and the Wahhabis came back in full force. Anyway, with the discovery of oil and the consolidation of Saudi power, the Al Saud family was no longer served by a military force that is out of control. You know, the Al Saud family needed to make profits, needed to run a country, needed to have international relations. Having a group of religious fanatics that are invading, you know, left and right, didn't serve the interests of the Al Saud family anymore. And so we see in the 1950s and the 1960s the Al Saud family having to rein in the religious Wahhabi power through various means, the most extreme of which was at one point where the Wahhabis refused to follow the orders of Al Saud. This was in the 1930s. And they were just going off killing who they thought were heretics in what is today Iraq, or what has always been Iraq, but they sort of invaded areas in Iraq and were slaughtering people that they considered to be heretics, which is pretty much everyone other than themselves. The Al Saud family were unable to control them, called upon the British government, which in a very famous incident took military action against Wahhabi forces with the full knowledge and approval of Al Saud. And the British Air Force basically mowed down the Wahhabi forces from the air. This, of course, will create a tension. On the one hand, the Wahhabis have provided Al Saud, the rulers of Saudi Arabia, with legitimacy, with religious credibility. They were the religious ideology upon which Saudi rule rests. But on the other hand, Al Saud will soon discover, and this sort of a lasting problem, is that if your power base relies on a fanatical religious force, well, it's very difficult to control this fanatical religious force. It is very easy for that religious force to turn against you if the religious force thinks that you have betrayed the cause, that you are no longer as religiously pristine as they would like you to be. Now, why am I mentioning all of this? Because all of this is important as background for especially the developments since 9/11. But we'll get there. So all of this is just so you have this sort of general background in understanding some of the major next moves. Take a step back, and as we said, that especially in the civil rights era, the idea of much of the civil rights movement implicitly adopts the idea of a civic religion, which theoretically is rooted in the French Revolution. The French Revolution played a very dominant role in the idea of society developing a civic religion which is a civil religion but godless. It believes in inherent values that often have to do with individual rights, but the thrust of the very idea of a civil religion is integration, is that everyone sort of belongs to the civil religion, and this civil religion takes priority to any other ideological force. You can have your ideology as long as, to use the Rawlsian sense, Rawls is a civil religion theorist. To use the Rawlsian language of, as long as there's overlapping consensus, in other words, as long as we all overlap upon basic civic values that are held as inherently true and unimpeachable. You want to call them constitutional values, even in countries like Israel or like England that don't have a written constitution, but the implied constitution is this civil religion, this basic civic values that trump all else. And you can have your religion as long as you coexist and integrate your religion with these civic values. The problem, though, is that theories of civil religion, like a lot of liberal-oriented theory, relies on assumptions, theoretical assumptions of the possibility of equal opportunity. And one very common critique is that theories of civil religion ignore realities of power, that ultimately, when you construct a civil order and civic values that are unimpeachable, that the people who end up consolidating their power and consolidating their privileges are the people who have traditionally occupied positions of superiority. In other words, that civic values relying on the myths of fair play, equal opportunity, end up reifying those on top, and the law becomes an agent to, in effect, protect privilege and to keep those on top. That's sort of the common critique. That's a subtle question. Yes, I mean, if you look at critical theory in France, it is very different than critical theory in America. And it is fair to say, yeah, it's clear that French critical theorists American critical theorists borrow a lot from French critical theorists, but they're responding to different things. I mean, they're responding to different historical circumstance. The thing about critical theory is that it exposes situations that perpetuate abuses of power, but it doesn't always suggest an alternative. And that's a very common critique of the critique of civil religion, is that, well, okay, so you're saying that you are consolidating privilege, that you are allowing those on top to stay on top, that often the values espoused by civic religion sort of act like an opiate of the people. They make people think that everyone has an equal opportunity, but in reality, inequality and unfairness continue. Okay, so what's the alternative? What can we do to replace that? And I'm not gonna, I don't generalizing is I'm very uncomfortable with it, because there are some critical theorists who, it's just that you have sometimes the alternative is seen as revolutionary, calls for a complete restructuring, and often a critique of the critique is that the alternatives are often idealistic or unrealistic, in the sense that, well, you're going to just end up creating different power structures that also end up being abusive. So, you're going to shake up those at the bottom, you're going to put on top, but eventually. So when George Orwell, for instance, wrote his very famous novel, I don't know, if you haven't read this novel, do yourself a favor before you leave this world. I know it's odd to tell people your age before you leave this world, but, George Orwell wrote a novel called Animal Farm. Anyone read Animal Farm? Okay, cool. The whole idea of Animal Farm is it's a very intelligent critique of how you start out with these lofty ideas that you're gonna build something that's very different, but that the sort of there are social forces that always end up gravitating towards the same abuses of power that you initially rebelled against. I know that that's sort of a long-winded way of answering you, but it just it has to be said. I mean, needs to be said. Okay. But okay, so my point though is, as your reading points out, is that the Black Muslim movement doesn't, looks at the civil religion with a great deal of skepticism for very understandable historical reasons. The same reasons that you find among Native Americans. Your espousal of great civic values have not worked that well for us. you know, we've been hearing about the great civic values for a very long time. These civic values were being espoused as lynchings were going on. These civic values were espoused as very unequal economic systems and unequal school systems and medical care systems. These same civic values have been, adhered to or espoused as you've grabbed more and more land and exploited more and more indigenous land and displaced more and more indigenous people. So the black Muslim paradigm, especially in the 50s and 60s, is that no, the challenge or the goal is not to integrate in the general civil religion, the white man's civil religion, but to create alternative communities of power. To create communities of power that are rooted in the black experience, rooted in the indigenous experience, that is culturally not diluted. Because part of the whole paradigm of the civic religion is that you dilute your identity into what is claimed to be an objective general order. Part of the mythology of law is objectivity. Well, the law doesn't care if you're white or black. But the whole idea of the critique that you would hear from people like Malcolm X, for instance, the critique of the few scholars who cared about the Native American legacy and history. It's remarkable that as humongous as the Native American story is, there are only, shockingly, a low number of scholars who even cared enough to specialize in this. And what are they saying? Law claims to be objective. Civic religion claims to be objective. A civic order claims to be objective, but it is not. In a nutshell, that it is. In fact, when you look at the historically lived experience, the claim of objectivity is a fantasy. Now, of course, what is very fascinating is that the federal government is fully aware of this. Regardless of how they express it theoretically. But they are very concerned that the black Muslim movement is creating defiant structures of power, autonomous communities of power. The whole idea of, reflect on a second, why do black Muslims wear suits and a bow tie? What are they communicating here? Any of you are sociology majors when you were in college? No sociology majors? Really? None of you? Okay, how about majored in anthropology? Man, I'm gonna have a word with our admission people. What is this? Okay, majored in political science. You majored in political science, so this should be easy for you. Wait, what was my question? I forgot. I got so blown away by the fact that none of you are sociology majors that I forgot my question. Well, actually, one is the articulation of power. It's sort of the expression of power. But, are they saying, who are they speaking to? I mean, this is a very, when they wear the suit and the bow tie, and who are they communicating? This insignia is directed at whom? Any of you seen black people from the Black Muslim movement? Raise your hands. Um, should I? Well, I was going to ask any of you have actually like had lived or interacted, but that's not going to be a fair question. Um, Come on. Who's brave enough to speculate about this? Okay. No, you're right on. I mean, and because if you read enough of the literature, including the speeches given by Elijah Muhammad, and then later on by Warith ad-Din, his son, or Malcolm X, I still have it. I have a. This was, of course, in the days before, electronic media and stuff like that. But one of the things that at one time in my life I was so proud of is that I managed to get a full collection of all the lectures of Malcolm X. Every lecture he gave, and they were all on cassette tapes, and you learn a great deal when you just listen to everything this man said. You're absolutely right. In a word, it's overcoming the accusation of being savages. The perception, the sort of the white order, or if you want to call it the civic order. Often the civic order says the civic values are about civilization and about not being barbarians and savages. Well, much of the ideology and dogma of the Black Muslim movement is that, in fact, regardless of how you've constructed your civic religion, you were indeed barbarians and savages. You victimized us through civilized savagery. Well, the adoption of a suit and sort of this is communicating discipline, communicating civilization, communicating and we're going to co-opt your uniforms, but we're not going to reproduce your savagery. And we directed to the sort of inner soul of the black man that you are not a savage and you are not to act like a savage. So one of the very interesting parts of the Black Muslim movement is that, there's a respectable amount of scholarship about this, is that they would make it a point wherever a Black Muslim mosque would open up, they would literally enter into a battle with drug dealers, with gangs. In other words, clean their communities, and they became quite famous for that. That they would sort of marshal the troops to, if need be, forcibly kick out all the drug dealers and all the prostitution and all the and clean the communities in which they lived. There are sort of a part of the very, I mean, I'm choosing my words carefully because it's interesting but also painful, is that as testimonies by black Muslims as to how when they would enter these battles with drug dealers and pimps and so on, the time and time again, they would end up being harassed by the police. Not the drug dealers, not the pimps, but they would be harassed. So that they end up fighting on two fronts. On the one hand, they're sometimes the drug dealers would kill members of their movement, but on the other hand, at the same time, they're often being stopped and harassed and frisked and detained, and you could read some very interesting testimonials on this. Anyway, now this point is rather delicate because the 1960s proved to be a very critical turning point on many fronts. We know that someone like Malcolm X, he ends up being assassinated, but perhaps other than the shadowy world of assassinations, is that we know that the federal government was directly involved, as I mentioned last class, in using informants not just to keep track of the black Muslim movements in general, but to also sow dissent and to actively try to push the black Muslim movement closer to Orthodox Islam. And I mentioned this fellow in not last class, but in I think the class before that. Elijah Muhammad's son, his name was Warith al-Din, the man who was the closest to his father's heart. Elijah Muhammad had many sons, but the son that was seen as the one most likely to inherit the black Muslim movement was Warith al-Din Muhammad. Warith al-Din and then Muhammad at the end. I'll put it. Warith al-Din Muhammad ends up being a very key figure in a very rather obscure, shadowy story. On the one hand, Saudi Arabia does everything possible to attract Warith al-Din Muhammad and to convince Warith al-Din to not follow in the footsteps of his father. And it's very interesting because this is sort of the fascinating world of, I don't know, real life, right? So what they do is, on the one hand you have Saudi Arabia, on the other hand you have the American government, and from declassified documents we know that the American government was actively involved through informants, paid agents, to try to get Warith al-Din to accept Saudi Arabia's overtures. Some scholars, although they haven't been able to produce any documentary evidence, but some scholars have said that clearly Saudi Arabia was also working on American instructions, so that it was foreign and internal. And what is it that they were trying to do? Well, to convince Elijah Muhammad's son that real Islam, Orthodox Islam, demands that you abandon the racial agenda. That it is un-Islamic to speak in racial terms. That Islam teaches that all races are the same, there's no difference between races. And I want you to reflect upon this in light of Cheryl Harris's article, which we'll get to, hopefully. The sort of the proper way of addressing the legacy of racism that you as a black person have gone through is to be non-racial. Very recently, there's a convert to Islam, a white guy called Jonathan Brown. This is typical. Jonathan Brown, as a white convert to Islam, just came out with a book called Islam and Blackness. And in this book, basically what he is saying, from what I've been able to skim, because I haven't read the book yet, is that Islam solved the issue of racism because Islam demanded that you be colorblind, racially blind. And that basically the same thing that Warith ad-Din was cajoled into, that the solution to racism is to be non-racial, to completely ignore race, and that the whole thing about to address the racism of the past, we must build our communities of racialized power, if you will. Native indigenous communities is very un-Islamic and an anathema to Islamic theology. Now, imagine if in fact this is, if Warith ad-Din eventually says, well, you know, yeah, I see in the light, Islam demands that we not think racially, and he has a huge impact by breaking away, or by, what he did is basically he said, I, as the leader of the Black Muslim movement, now I abandon all my father's teachers and I adopt all these Orthodox Islamic teachers, quote unquote, Saudi Islam type thing. Was he completely autonomous, or was it carefully engineered? And it deals a severe blow to the Black Muslim movement. The Black Muslims who refused to follow Warith ad-Din ended up, this is where Farrakhan comes. How many of you have heard of Farrakhan? Louis Farrakhan? How many of you never heard of Farrakhan? Okay. So this is the fellow who took over who stayed loyal to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, and I think he spells it like this, Farrakhan. And so basically he told Elijah's son, Warithuddin, okay, fine, goodbye, good luck with all the followers that you took, but I remain loyal to the teachings of the original teacher, to Elijah, and I will continue leading the Black Muslim movement as a racialized movement of power. So I don't buy into this, the cure is to think non-racially and etc., etc. The thing about, though, is that the Black Muslim movement never recovered from this. It was never the same. They still exist. They're still, in certain communities, quite powerful, but it's nothing like what they used to be. And quickly, what sort of emerges on the scene is something of a very different mutation. Sort of, as the world history, ideas always mutate, always evolve, always develop, and sometimes in very unpredictable ways. Okay. In the 1960s, there is what emerges in the 1960s is a powerful decolonial movement. The decolonial movement is led by various theorists, many of them French, people like Fanon, who argue, and it intermingles with race, because a lot decolonial theory is a wide platform and with different points of emphasis and focus. But basically, the nutshell of it is that colonized people, indigenous people, have a right to be nationally liberated. They have a right to self-determination. Self-determination and national liberation is not possible unless you overcome the legacy of colonialism. Unless you decolonize, unless you overthrow the power structures that were crafted by colonialism that keep the formerly colonized people in a continuing subservient position, that theorists like Fanon, also to a lesser extent, I mean, this is a time where famous figures like Shivara in South America emerges, but the constant critique is that if you look at how the world is organized, former colonies have never truly gained independence from their colonizers. Economically, culturally, politically, they remain extremely dependent on their former masters. And their former masters continue to exploit their natural resources. The natural resources always come from former colonies. The natural resources go to the colonial masters. So the colonial masters will process the natural resources through industry and then will export products back to people who were formerly colonized. And that this cycle, where basically underdeveloped, is polite word for basically subservient people. And the subservient people always are led by corrupt rulers who are always in league with former colonial powers that effectively treat former colonies as cheap labor, extremely inexpensive labor, to extract natural resources so that colonial masters can then have industry and talk about enlightenment and all of that, and then export these products to consumers who are predominantly in the silent masses of former colonies. And then, of course, some of the national liberation movement, especially national liberation theorists from Africa, also brought in the race element and said it's not a coincidence that all the colonial powers were white and that the so-called developed civilized world continues to be white, and everyone in the underdeveloped side of things is not white, and that the South remains backwards, but it is not because, as the colonial masters told the people in the South, that they're dark-skinned and lazy and stupid and ignorant and undisciplined, etc. It is none of that, but it is because of hegemony and dominance. What national liberation ideology, please bear with me, don't be bored, because this is all important background material. And trust me, it's not easy to come to hear anyone talk about this stuff anymore, unless you go back to college and take a course on Marxism or something like that. But anyway, so part of the national liberation ideology was to hearken back, and this is a very distinct element, right? To hearken back to certain strands in the French Revolution and in the Russian Revolution, certain philosophers in both of these revolutions, especially that tended to be either Marxists or anarchists, who spoke. Today we talk about terror. One of the classes I teach on called Political Crimes, we talk about the history of political criminology, but one of the things that if you took a class like this you would learn is that originally the idea of terror was used by French theorists in the French Revolution and in the Russian Revolution not as a negative term, but it was actually used as a positive term. The idea that as a revolutionary you will terrorize the oppressors, that the oppressors are not going to give you your freedom unless you put the fear of God in them. That's the origin of. So initially, when in Europe, when bombs were going off all over Europe by anarchists or Marxist revolution, this is later, or before that, even as close to the Russian Revolution and French Revolution as possible in the 1800s, the ideology, the creed was, we are not going to get our freedom unless we terrorize the oppressors. The oppressors continue oppressing through the exploitation of the instrumentalities of terror. The way that the oppressors use terror is a dignified word like police force. But in effect, the oppressors, traditional oppressors, the oppressors who eradicated so many indigenous cultures, etc., create instrumentalities of law that, when all is said and done, terrorize the people that they seek to dominate. And the response to this, the answer to this, is to employ terror against a terrorizer. So these ideas are extremely influential, especially in underdeveloped countries in the 1960s, 50s, 60s, but especially in the 60s. The idea that of national liberation, of self-determination, of terror as an instrument of national liberation and self-determination, and they are also very influential very influential in the Muslim world. Initially, the people who espouse these ideas are not Islamists. Initially, they are either secular Marxists in the Muslim world, so there are very famous nationalist Marxist movements in the Muslim world that really develop these ideas for various Muslim contexts, or less common, less in the Muslim world at least, are anarchists. These are not as common as the Marxists, but there's no question that Marxism especially was the one that was sort of or Marxist influence. They're not necessarily communists either, but Marxist influence. There's a big difference between communist and Marxist, and sort of a Marxist influence, but not a full, someone who didn't necessarily read Marxist Capital, all of it, but they've read enough of Marxist theory to adopt and to co-opt certain ideas about national liberation and self-determination and so on. What are Islamic movements doing at the time? Well, Islamic movements at the time, this is again 50s or 60s, are an organization like the Muslim Brotherhood, probably the most famous of the Islamic movements, actually emerges initially. The reason this organization was born was as a response to active, aggressive evangelist movements in Muslim countries. So many Islamic movements created in the Muslim world, initially what they're worried about is the part, as we talked about in the past, what comes with colonialism is very aggressive evangelism, the attempt to spread Christianity as the faith of civilization and the faith of the white man. And at the same time, many Islamic movements organized as anti-colonial movements, but at this stage, when we talk about terrorism, terrorism was far more an earmark of nationalistic, secular nationalistic movements in the Muslim world than Islamic movements. There is, however, a huge event that will turn everything upside down. Are you still awake? Are you all with me? Stay awake. Don't get bored. Trust me. You need this. Okay, huge event in 1967. The massive defeat of Arab armies at war with Israel, and coincidentally, at the same time, the military conflict between India and Pakistan over Kashmir and other territory where Pakistan doesn't do too well. Now, why does this have such a huge impact? Well, what a lot of people do not know is the defeat that Israel delivered to Arab countries. It delivered to Arab countries that were ruled by secular nationalist governments. Syria was a secular nationalist government. Egypt was a secular nationalist government. Jordan was a secular nationalist government. The humiliating defeat of these nationalist, secular, often pan-Arabists, meaning that they believed in Arab unity, not Islamic unity, but Arab unity. The defeat of these secular nationalist, humiliating defeat at that, of all these governments, as well as in more complex ways, because it's multifaceted, but the sort of the breaking away of East Pakistan because of Indian military intervention and it becoming Bangladesh, the secularization of Turkey, which was the seat of the former caliphate. Turkey becomes an aggressively secular state that abandons even the Arabic script and adopts the Latin script. And the reaction to this is, as these secular nationalist governments are defeated, there is a void, an ideological void. Who fills the ideological void? So, in other words, after colonialism, the people that took power in one country, one Muslim country after another, are secular nationalist governments. These secular nationalist governments are all influenced by a lot of Marxist ideas. So the Ba'ath Party, for instance, where am I? Can someone write Ba'ath on the chat? Because I for some reason I can't find the button to. Oh, here it is. So, for instance, the Ba'ath Party in Syria or the Ba'ath Party in Iraq, this is the party that has been in power. This is the party of Saddam Hussein when we invaded Iraq, is staunchly secular, staunchly nationalistic, staunchly Arab, staunchly anti-Islamic, and on top of all of that is very influenced by various Marxist ideas. So there is a very heavy Marxist influence in the ruling party in Syria, in Iraq, in Egypt. So these secular nationalistic governments that came to power after colonialism, often talking about decolonialism, often talking about national liberation, always talking about how they're, going to overcome the legacy of colonialism by empowerment, empowering the people, etc., etc. The fact that their armies folded in 6 days in fighting a very young military force, the Israeli force. I mean, people who came as immigrants created an army that is fairly young. Of course, the secular nationalists said, well, the reason Israel was able to defeat us like this is because, imperial powers, imperialism is helping Israel. But it just didn't cut it. And as a result, we see the explosion of Islamic movements upon the scene in the 1970s. So, ending in the 1960s and the 1970s. And the explosion of Islamic movements on the scene now has gone beyond, we don't like aggressive, the colonially backed evangelists. Evangelical movements create schools to educate our children who grow up, even if they're not Christian, who grow up thinking like white men, although they were educated in Egypt or in whatever. I forgot one other element that I have to tell you about. A sworn enemy of secular nationalist movements all along this dynamic of the most prominent of the sworn enemies of secular nationalist, anti-colonial, anti-imperial movements is none other than the government of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, which did not take part in the 1967 war and as a result was not defeated, looks at these movements, the Nasser in Egypt or the ruler of Syria, especially Egypt and Syria, as dangerous to its own power base. I mean, their power is based on Islamic Puritanism. Secular nationalists, their power is based on Marxist ideas, and they are very uncomfortable with the idea that this revolutionary fervor might catch on in Saudi Arabia, and then the Saudis will overthrow the Saudi royal family. And so they are sworn enemies of the secular nationalist movements, and you've discovered some amazing things about Saudi Arabia's reaction to the defeat of Arab states in 1967. Basically, in a nutshell, from all the testimonials now of politicians before they died and so on, Saudi Arabia was very happy and thought, great, maybe we'll get over all this revolutionary talk about self-determination and national liberation and anti-imperialism. Saudi Arabia had a very cozy, warm relationship with its former colonial, with Britain and especially the US. And all this talk about anti-imperialism and overthrowing the bourgeois and the oppression of the masses and so on, it was extremely uncomfortable for Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia doesn't speak just as we, the Saudi royal family. Everything that Saudi Arabia says or does, it couches in the language of what Islam wants. because they are the custodian of the holy sites. So indeed, after 67, Saudi Arabia sees this as a great opportunity to once and for all sort of remove the danger of the radical masses and to establish itself as sort of the natural moral leader, if not direct political leader, of the entire Muslim world. No, that's a good question. Okay, I'll tell you what. Let me continue with the narrative and see if I answer the question. If I don't, remind me. Okay? Because I think the continuing the narrative might answer this question. So, on the one hand, you've got Saudi Arabia and the Islam that it wants to the Islam that it supports and it backs up. But on the other hand, you have, with the defeat of the secular nationalists, now there are a variety of Islamic movements that see themselves as a restorer of a lost authenticity, a return to indigenous culture, indigenous institutions, a reclamation of the true self of the people, to overcome the alienation of colonialism. Most prominent among these movements, of course, are the Jama'at in Pakistan and Egypt, or the Ikhwan Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and all over the Muslim world, because they became a widely successful movement. There are many others. There are movements like Ansar Muhammad, who were also in Egypt and in North Africa, many others. I mean, the names, as long as you just remember Muslim Brotherhood and Jama'at, you're fine. What are these movements about? The Saudis, and when I say the Saudis, the only type of Islam they know and have adhered to up to this point is Wahhabi Islam. And as I said, Wahhabi Islam is obsessive about things like the Shia, obsessive about calling mystics or Sufis heretics, obsessive in its anti-racialist orientation, obsessive in being very conservative and very restrictive towards women. The Islamic groups that emerge have a different focus. On the one hand, they're rooted in anti-colonialism. But on the other hand, what they want is to reclaim some indigenous authenticity. And this is my own evaluation, right? They want to claim some indigenous authenticity, a return to an indigenous reality, but they don't know how. Why don't they know how? Because many of the leaders of these movements are not, political theorists or even famous theologians. They're quite often engineers and medical doctors or other scientists. Why is that? I just, don't get bored. Bear with me, because the stuff I'm telling you is, I can tell you, it's gold. It's you have no idea how many books you have to consume. But okay, so why is it that these movements are predominantly led by science people? Well, just sit back and reflect on this. Part of the legacy of colonialism was the peddling the complex, or giving indigenous cultures a complex about scientism and empiricism. What did I just say? For instance, there was a very famous French theorist called Comte. After the French Revolution, Comte writes a very famous treatise that says the reason we in the West became the civilized people of the world, the reason we lead the world, the reason we got beyond barbarism, the reason we are not Muslim, we are not Africa, we are not any of the backwards people, is because we've learned to think scientifically. And we, by we he means white people, have learned we are disciplined by nature. We are rational by nature. These people are emotional. These people can't think empirically. And because they can't think empirically, they lack the discipline, they lack the humor, the temper. They deal with mythology and superstition and folk culture. What our civilizing mission is to teach these people to think like scientists. The impact, so among the Comte, one of the first things that Comte does after the Napoleon invasion of Egypt is that he organizes this institute in Egypt, an institute of science and civilization, which is supposed to carry the white man's burden in teaching Egyptians to think rationally, because Egyptians are not, they're barbarians, they're not rational people. But this institute proves to be unbelievably influential, not just in Egypt, but all the way to India. Muslim intellectuals are deeply influenced by the idea that if we want to catch up with the West, if we don't want to be backwards anymore, if we don't want to lag behind the rest of the world, we need, as Comte said, and as the French occupiers said, this is when France occupied Egypt and Palestine and Syria and so on and so forth, is that we need to think scientifically. This is further affirmed with French colonialism in Algeria, French colonialism in Syria, British colonialism in Britain, British colonialism in Palestine. constantly the idea that you want to understand why we are civilized and you are not is because we think rationally and you do not. We know how to think logically. So there emerges a huge cultural transformation all over the Muslim world. Before colonialism, do I have your attention? Are you awake? Okay. Before colonialism, the most prestigious job or the most prestigious education was to be a what? Can you guess? Yeah, to be a jurist. To actually go to the equivalent of law school and to train as a Muslim jurist. That you were, a rock star. Everyone would want to marry you. After colonialism, that became the lowest, the least prestigious thing. What became the most prestigious? To be a doctor or an engineer. So all the Islamists, like when the black Muslim movement wears a suit and bow, all the Islamists want to prove that we're not backwards. We're not barbarians. We're not savages. So what do they go into? They go into scientific endeavors, especially medicine and engineering. They're proving that they're civilized. But that comes at the expense of legal education. Islamic schools, Islamic law schools, including Islamic seminaries, deteriorate to incredible extents. I mean, I can't even... There's a book called The Rise of Colleges of Islam, if you want to understand the history of law schools in Islam. It's by a man called George Maqdisi. He was a professor at Penn. I actually studied with him. He's the one that sort of alerted me to the importance of educational institutions. Islamic law schools are a shadow of their former glorious selves. It's like if you can imagine, you take the prestigious law schools in the United States, and suddenly these law schools are admitting not the people who get the best scores, but the people who get the worst scores, who can't go to medicine or can't go to engineering or can't get a career even in tourism. And so they're sort of the bottom of the barrel. And imagine that these law schools, instead of being very as expensive as they are, they're actually the cheapest. They're actually extremely poorly funded. But for Islamic movements, that's not the type of affirmation of the self that they want to go for. So now, how does this have an impact? Well, I know I'm out of time, but this has an enormous impact in the type of thinking and the type of programs that are going to be asserted by Islamic movements in order to reclaim an indigenous self. Remember that for these, you have Saudi Islam on the one hand, that is obsessed about orthopraxy, correct practice. But Islamic movements that arise out of countries like Pakistan or Indonesia or Egypt, they want a reclamation of the indigenous self, but how are they going to do it? That's the billion-dollar question. Okay,